for community conversations, I have a sign-up sheet in the back. If I don't have your email, leave your name and your email, and I will send you information on future presentations and also summaries of the talks that we have. So I'm going to call. Well, next time on the 5th of August, we are going to have a presentation on fracking and all the mining that's being done for oil and how it's affecting our air and our water quality. And it's called Dear President Obama. I think that's the title of it, but it is actually, some of the things are controversial according to my husband, but it does, have a viewpoint, a concern about our environment. So just to let you know ahead of time that that's coming up on the 5th of August. So Jane, do you want to come up and introduce our speaker?
And I may not use that, okay? It's my honor to introduce Dr. Tim Schiell. Is that how you say Schiell? Schiell, okay. He started at Stout since 1992. He's a professor of philosophy and the director of a civil liberties focused center for the studies of institutions and innovation. Dr. Schiell primarily teaches ethics courses, including studies of Ayn Rand's ethics, and a scholar of various topics in ethics, ethics education and free speech. He has written books, chapters, articles, and has done over 100 scholarly or public presentations and workshops, and has brought in over $4 million in grants to the university. Today's topic is the philosophy of Ayn Rand. He will talk about such things as who is she, what were her objectivist teachings, how do her ideas apply to the real world scenarios, why has she inspired many devoted followers, but also so many rabid critics. So, Dr. Schiell, thank you for this.
Thank you for coming out on a beautiful day, and I hope we have a really interesting discussion. I teach Ayn Rand. I've studied her philosophy for quite a number of years, but I don't consider myself an expert, so I will not be able to answer all of your questions. I will do my best to answer your questions. Being a philosopher, my remarks will be largely focused on her philosophy and not so much on her life or other people in her life or things like that. Although we'll do a little bit of that because she's quite an interesting character in her own right apart from her philosophy. So let's just jump right in. So brief biographies, a few highlights that maybe give you a little insight into her. She's a Russian emigre. Let me ask first, how many of you have read or know a bit about Ayn Rand already? Okay, this part's going to be stuff you already know then, right? Not necessarily. Her upbringing shaped her tremendously. Her father was a pharmacist, successful pharmacist. He owned the building. When the Bolsheviks took over, this was not a good thing. They were also Jewish, not a good thing. Her mother didn't really want children, not a good thing. So she grew up in difficult situations. She was bright, very early age. She was the kind of person she was later in life. Very outgoing, very confident, adversarial, the whole bit from an early age. She went to university, graduated in Petrograd, studied, I think it was history and literature were her main areas. She was very disappointed because at that point the Bolsheviks were starting to infiltrate the university and she felt like she didn't get the education she hoped, and it set her on her anti-communist, I'll use the term libertarian, although she would be very mad at me for using that word to describe her, for reasons we might get into a little bit as we go on. She had to get out. She was fortunate, she had family connections. She was able to get out. In 1926, she came to the United States. She was on a mission, most definitely, very ambitious, atheist, staunchly anti-communist, and she changed her name. There's been lots of discussion and debate about the name. The official story from the Ayn Rand Institute is that it was an abbreviation of her original name, Rosenbaum. If you look at the Cyrillic letters, you can see how you can get Rand out of Rosenbaum because of the way the Cyrillic letters work. Interestingly, she didn't tell any of her followers that that wasn't her given name. Through her life, they all thought she was Ayn Rand and did not know she was actually Alyssa Rosenbaum. She met Frank Connor. She went to Hollywood. She wanted to be a big-time writer and playwright. They married a few years after she got here. Through a lot of hard effort and hobnobbing and every other method writers can use to make it, she got connected with a group of people, and well, one of them we'll talk about a little bit later, Isabel Patterson. Does that name ring a bell for anyone? Isabel Patterson was Ayn Rand before Ayn Rand's time. Only a nicer person and not focused on selfishness, but the same sort of political and ethical orientation. Who sort of helped her get established in a lot of ways and made connections in the literary world for her. I think of her as sort of being like a mentor for Ayn. So she did eventually hit it big. She wrote a couple of books that were bestsellers and attracted quite a following. New York City was the place to be, so she moved there. She formed her, it was called a collective, an ironic name for somebody who's as anti-collectivist as you can get. I really think was a better term as a cult. It was really the Ayn Rand cult. It was a cult of personality, really. She had the kind of personality where you are going to love her or you are going to hate her. There's no middle ground with Ayn Rand. And this impacted her philosophy greatly. There is no middle ground. That group attracted a lot of people who eventually became very influential, including Alan Greenspan, a name I assume most of you are familiar with, played a very significant role in our economic policies for a great many years. A young man named Nathaniel Brandon got interested in her philosophy, worked very hard, finally arranged a meeting. They hit it off, became fast friends. They eventually even became lovers. He was a very bright guy himself, and sort of pushed her to leave popular philosophy and literature and devote herself more to real scholarly writing. So from about 1957 on, she really focused on that part of her work. And that's why you don't hear much about her works other than those two earlier popular pieces of literature. Not a lot of people can read her technical philosophy, including philosophers, for reasons we'll get into as we go along too. She became a popular public intellectual, political activist, and so on. Died in 1982 in New York City. Her legacy lives on very strongly through the Ayn Rand Institute, which was founded by her legal and intellectual heir, Leonard Peikoff. There was a split between her followers. The hardcore, uncompromising, Rand got everything exactly right crowd, which is the ARI crowd, Leonard's group, and the group that thought, well, maybe she didn't get everything exactly right, maybe we can extend her ideas in ways she didn't anticipate, group, heretics. That's the group that originally was the Institute for Objectivist Studies, changed its name to the Objectivist Center, and eventually became the Atlas Society, which it's been since 2005 or 6 or something like that. That's David Kelly's group. So Rand, like I said, interesting personality in its own right. So it's just fun to mention a few of her what I will call quirks. You might call them something else. This is a perfect quote for her, right? The question isn't who is going to let me, it's who's going to stop me. And obviously the answer for her was nobody's going to stop me. So as I mentioned, she kept her original name a secret. Nathaniel Brandon, who was her business partner, or one of her biggest promoters, she had an affair with for many years. Her and her husband had some sort of an open relationship. He was also married. His wife knew about it. Eventually they split because he had another affair with a young model and didn't tell her. And had this affair for 4 years, and when she found out about it, that was the end of it. He was out of her life, no more business or any other relationship with this guy at all. So he was out. She had this habit where when she would meet people for the first time, she wouldn't say like, hi, or what's your name, or something like that. She'd say, what are your premises? And then whatever you answered, she would, of course, argue with you vehemently to become an objectivist. That's just her. She was a chain smoker, caffeine addict, and popped a lot of amphetamines. This was a woman who was on the go 24 hours a day. She didn't think smoking would cause cancer. Well, it did, and she died of it. She despised men with facial hair. So a bunch of us would have to leave the room if she were here. She had odd views about the roles of women. And I wish this was something I could explain, but I can't. I'm not sure anybody can. She seemed to approve of women, like herself, working themselves into leadership roles when they had the qualities and abilities to do so. But if any of you saw her interview with Phil Donahue back in the 70s, I think it was, somebody from the audience asks, would you support a woman running for president? She says, absolutely not. A good woman would never want to be president. That's a man's job. How about a senator or a congressman? Oh yeah, that's fine. A woman can be that, but not president. I have no explanation for why she would have a view like that. And she even described herself on more than one occasion as a male chauvinist. And again, without explanation, so I don't really know exactly what she meant by that. She had this view that women should find a man they can admire and sort of like hero worship, not of the individual man, but of masculinity itself somehow. That was true femininity. So, again, I don't really have an explanation for that. She said lots of interesting things. One of the interesting things she said was European conquest of the Native Americans was justified because we brought them civilization. She, in many of her writings, talked about how force and fraud were out of bounds. So in your rational pursuit of your self-interest, you shouldn't use force and you shouldn't use fraud. But at the same time, in private letters, she commended child killer as someone who sort of epitomized her idea of the independent, autonomous, full-blown Superman type. So we'll talk a little bit about Friedrich Nietzsche, because her philosophy is meant to be a watered-down version of Nietzsche's. Nietzsche familiar to anybody? Nietzsche's philosophy is about master morality versus slave morality. So the master morality is the morality of somebody who, in Nietzsche's view, says yes to the real world the way it really is, In the real world, the way it really is everybody using each other. It's the law of the jungle, dog eat dog. So that's the way you should live. You should accept that. So slave morality is the person who doesn't want to accept that, who thinks there are some kind of high moral ideals that trump this reality, and we should try to make the world a better and different place. Those are the losers for Nietzsche. And the winners should crush the losers. The losers exist for the winners to exploit, and that's it. So that might sound a lot like Rand, depending on which Rand you're reading, but that's the idea of this no force or fraud. This was her way of saying, I'm not going as far as Nietzsche. But on the other hand, when she makes a comment like that, you go, wow, really, were you? It's hard to tell. So, as I mentioned earlier, she had issues with those who eventually became libertarians, called themselves libertarians. Not really so much because of differences in their political views. Both Rand and libertarians support economic liberty and civil liberty. So there were particular issues on which they disagreed, but generally their philosophical orientation was the same on economic and civil issues. She really despised them because she thought they stole her ideas and didn't give her credit for it. And there's a person in particular named John Hospers that's sort of one of the culprits in that story. John Hospers was a professor of political philosophy at the University of Southern California. His philosophy led him to become a Rand admirer, and he eventually helped found and was the first presidential candidate as a libertarian back in, this would have been the 70s. I'm not sure which election in the 70s, 72 maybe? He even got an electoral vote. The only philosopher who will ever get an electoral vote in a presidential election. But she felt like he learned from her, stole her ideas, formed this party, didn't give her any credit, so libertarians were all evil and stupid, and she hated the term, and if you described her as a libertarian, she would stab you with her eyes. So here's some quotes I think that are representative of some of her key ideas. So one of these is, the achievement of your happiness is the only moral purpose of your life, and that happiness, not pain or mindless self-indulgence, is the proof of your moral integrity, since it is the proof and the result of your loyalty to the achievement of your values. So the idea is, you need to figure out what you want in life. And when you figure out what that is, you should do everything you can to get it. And if you succeed, you'll be happy. If you do anything other than that, you'll fall short of real happiness. If you don't know what you want, if you don't know how to get it, if you don't do what it takes to get it, you won't be happy. In some ways, it's that simple for her. Oh, by the way, if you have a question about something, it sort of needs immediate attention, just jump in. So I just love this one because this really gives the mindset of Ayn Rand. There are two sides to every issue. One is right, the other is wrong. The middle is always evil. And her idea was, this is connected to her idea of reason, which is hugely important in her philosophy. Her idea of reason is sort of like introductory baby logic. There's either this or that, and there can be no other alternative. So almost every argument she ever makes from a philosopher's point of view commits the fallacy of a false dilemma. She never considers a third option, a fourth option, or the possibility that these two things aren't really contradictory, that they're really complementary, or that they each contain a partial truth. But not a possibility in her mindset. So everything in her philosophy is really geared around the idea that right there. There are two options, one is right, one is wrong, and anybody who compromises is not just wrong, they're evil. So she despised both political parties. From her point of view, they're both accommodationists, right? Republicans aren't hard enough on economic liberty, although they're okay on that from her point of view, but they're wrong about civil liberty, at least back in the day, throwing aside all the current hate speech, whatever stuff going on. The Democrats, of course, are wrong on the economic liberty, but they had the civil liberty part right. So why did she and her followers lean Republican? Because economic liberty has priority over civil liberty, which we'll get into a little bit later. This is one my students really like in the ethics class, because in the ethics class we talk a lot about what I call traditional ethics. So the ethics taught of these very long-standing traditional systems: Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Native American ethics. And this is her response to those people, to that traditional ethical point of view. Sometimes that ethical point of view is distinctly based in a religious point of view, like traditional divine command Christian ethics. Sometimes it's based in a more humanistic system, like Buddhist ethics is really more humanistic. It doesn't really involve any belief in divine beings. And her response to all this: for centuries, the battle of morality was fought between those who claimed your life belonged to God, Christians, Jews, Muslims, etc., and those who claimed it belonged to your neighbors, the secular Buddhists, the secular Hinduism, etc. Between those who preach that the good is self-sacrifice for the sake of ghosts in heaven or incompetence on earth. No one came to say, except me, Ayn Rand, that your life belongs to you and the good is to live. So I have to insert here again one of the reasons philosophers pay almost no attention to Rand. I'm an oddball philosopher. I pay attention to Rand. Not so much because I admire her philosophy or her philosophical skills, but because she's important. People know something about her. We need to talk about things that other people talk about, and not just our little inside favorite philosophers. Rand didn't have an original philosophical idea in her life, and she never really credited much of any other prior philosophers. The idea that the life belongs to you and the good is to live it is an ancient idea. There's nothing new about it. You can read Plato's Republic, written in 400 BC, and he addresses this point of view. You can read it in ancient Hindu literature. You can read it in ancient Buddhist literature. It's not a new idea. Her particular spin on it is a little bit different than prior spins on it. I give her credit for that. This is another, I think, important one, at least in theory. I'm not always sure that her theory fits with what she promoted in practice or did in practice, but that's not uncommon in philosophy for the ideal to not quite match up to the practice. Man's life is not the life of a mindless brute, of a looting thug, or a mooching mystic, but the life of a thinking being, not life by means of force or fraud, but life by means of achievement. This is one of the quotes where she's trying to separate herself from the Nietzsche crowd. A little bit unjustifiably, Nietzsche got associated with the Nazi movement in Germany, but that's mainly because he had a rotten sister who wanted to kiss up to the Nazis and tried to sneak in the parts of his philosophy for them to use that fit with their system. So this is a big one, because a lot of people look at her idea of selfishness and they say, well, then I should never help another person. It's all just always about me and only me. And her response to that kind of an idea is to say, you ask if it's ever proper to help another man. No, if he claims it as his right or as a moral duty you owe him. Yes, if such is your own desire based on your own selfish pleasure in the value of his person and struggle. So, in other words, morally you owe nobody else nothing unless you've contracted otherwise. Then you can owe them. But you can voluntarily help anybody you want. Does that make sense?
She wouldn't like the healthcare bill.
She wouldn't like much of anything modern government does. Yeah, we'll get into that as we go along. So she didn't oppose people helping people. She opposed people helping people because they were under some, in her point of view, mistaken impression that they owed it to them or they were obligated to do it in some way. No, do it because it makes you happy. Do it because you're getting what you want out of that exchange. Everything, one way you think about Rand is everything is in effect a financial transaction. Not just financial transactions. Everything you do has the character of a financial transaction. You want me to do the dishes, honey? Then what are you going to do for me? Everything has the nature of a transaction and a contract to be legitimate.
Doesn't this totally ignore the fact that you raise children and those children could never be useful adults unless you gave them a great deal? I mean, that's the human condition. That's the problem with being a human with a big head. You know, there are constraints because of that. And so the child takes years and years to develop. And that, what she's doing is throwing that all aside and then picking, you know, industrial life or business life as life. And the two are life. It's not one or the other.
Can I?
Sure. Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that I've often thought about the phrase from the Bible where Jesus says, if someone asks you for his shirt, so this is obviously between them, you should give him his shirt, your shirt and your coat. You know, if someone asks you for your shirt, you should give them your shirt and your coat. You know, because, and I don't know, I often wondered about that because they need it, because he has enough and they don't have enough, or I know that's just you know, that's kind of the extreme of the other way, but I'm just.
Yeah, I mean, Rand was a very devout atheist, and anybody basing anything in scripture from whatever religious tradition, for her, it would be a sign that you've given up on reason and you're relying on faith. So she was a very big critic of faith of any sort. I think one of the quotes I have coming up is her comment on faith.
Great.
So, in fact, this is one of the interesting things about her philosophy. The party that's most adopted Rand's views also is a party that has many very religious followers. And how you can reconcile Rand with that is an intellectual challenge I've not seen surmounted.
I was just in a conversation where someone was saying that her shift from being a writer of popular fiction to a philosopher was really coached by other entities. And I'm curious about her training as a philosopher or a scholar. Was she published in scholarly?
No.
And what was her education all of that?
Well, as I recall, it was primarily history and literature. So, but I mean, you have to remember, 1924. So, in those days, you would have had a much more rounded education than specialized like we would get nowadays. So she was probably well-read in the classics and in a number of different areas. She didn't go to one of the polytech-ish universities. She went to one of the more liberal artsy-ish.
And maybe had a bachelor's degree in history.
Right. Whatever their equivalent would have been. And again, I'm sure it would be different in 1924 than it would be in our era. But she was in an educated family and got a legitimate university education.
Yeah, but also, someone who is as smart as she was doesn't have to sit in a classroom like this and have someone enlighten our dark understanding. We can figure that out ourselves.
But
Or
I
she can
remember.
figure it out herself.
Right, but there's one of your previous slides that said in 1957, she made the switch to a more scholarly direction.
Right.
I wonder did that ever look like what other scholars would recognize as scholarship, or was it like within the Hartland Institute or something like that?
Like I said, most philosophers don't read her, and those that do find her writing to be lower than you would want in philosophical writing. She was not, so every discipline develops its own lingo, right? And the people you need to cite and you need to read in order to be accepted in the discipline. So if you're self-taught, as she was in philosophy, you're not necessarily going to know who are the people I have to cite and what are the arguments I have to address, because these are the ones you people pay attention to. She paid attention to what she was interested in and not other stuff. And frankly, she didn't give a hoot if academic philosophers paid any attention to her or not. Her audience was a very different audience, and she got the audience she wanted.
To what extent was she influenced, like, by the John Birch Society or?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, as far as I know, she was pushed to some extent by this Brandon character who wanted her to have a more intellectual foundation for the literature. And I think there are, if you think about that era in which this is happening. So this is the era William Buckley founds National Review, right? That was 56 or 7, in that same era. So this is an era conservatives are trying to develop an intellectual basis to rival the liberal philosophy, which had been dominant since the 30s, right? So I think that's also influencing her to try to develop a more intellectual foundation so she can be the leader of this new libertarian, strike the word, that movement that everybody's interested in that's not libertarian, but is, she wants to label it objectivist and give it that philosophical weight. Buckley, of course, wanted to go in a very different direction philosophically in supporting his version. Right? His is very heavily faith-based, based in his interpretation of a Christian tradition and all the rest of it. So they didn't get along at all, and he was a longtime critic of Rand's work.
You're also in an era of the Soviet Union and an enormous effort anti-Soviet in this country.
Yeah.
And how that made her views very popular.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. Yep. Oh, I guess I forgot one there. Government help to business is just as disastrous as governmental persecution. The only way a government can be of service to national prosperity is keeping its hands off. So she was old school laissez-faire capitalism. Government provides protection against murder and theft and extortion and similar things and nothing else. And here's another, I think, barometer of her thinking and her approach and her philosophy. Money is the barometer of a society's virtue, and you could insert the term individual there too. Money is the barometer of the individual's virtue.
And that's the accumulation of money, not the dispersion of money.
Absolutely, absolutely. So it's not terribly different from the Christian crowd that says wealth shows God's favor on you. She would just leave the God part out. So a lot of people admire Rand or admire her works. I'm going to run through some pictures here, most of whom you'll recognize. There'll probably be a few you won't. And I don't want to say that that means these people endorse everything Rand said, everything Rand wrote, or everything Rand thought. Many of them only accept certain parts of her philosophy. But it's an interesting group. Well, these are a little small, so you might have a hard time picking them out. But good old Barry Goldwater, presidential candidate in 1964, was a Rand admirer. President Reagan, another one.
What does it say?
Government is not the solution to your problem, to our problem. Government is the problem. That's very Randian. Very Randian. Now, of course, somebody asked her what she thought about Ronald Reagan as a president. Does anybody know what her response was? She said something like, I don't think anything about him. And the more I think about him, the more I want to not think about him. So, I mean, part of that was his connection to the religious right, which she would have no truck with. But part of it was she didn't think he had any intellectual sophistication, was a dimwit, and of course that too. And his foreign policy, she wasn't a fan of his foreign policy. And of course he didn't take the economic liberty part far enough, and I mean there'd be no end to her complaints about any politician, really. He accommodated Democrats for wholly. You don't do that, right? You don't accommodate anybody. Clarence Thomas, sitting Associate Supreme Court Justice. Paul Ryan, for many years would talk about Ayn Rand and how he admired Ayn Rand and etc. And when he became vice presidential candidate in 2010, he suddenly wasn't quite so chummy with Ayn Rand anymore. Because of course that would not go well with the religious right. So he toned it down at that point. He has claimed since then he rejects her philosophy. Make of that what you will, I guess. Ron Johnson, senator from Wisconsin, another fan of Ayn Rand. Ron Paul and his son Rand Paul. Rand is, according to Ron, not named after Ayn Rand. His given name is Randall, and Rand is just short for Randall. But isn't that an odd coincidence? A little too coincidental. Alan Greenspan, we mentioned earlier. Alan Greenspan, does anybody know what his reaction to the Great Recession was in 07 and 8?
Didn't he say something like, oops, I made a mistake?
Yeah, he did. He did. He said the market doesn't work.
Yeah.
Now, you know, it was probably just a momentary lapse in the ideology. He's probably recovered and he's probably back on board with full bore market. But yeah, for a minute there he was. Anybody know who that is? Again, it's a little bit small. Peter, is it Thiel? The guy who founded PayPal? And now is worth billions and is into all this, Google. He's into a lot of very interesting things now with his wealth. He's a big Ayn Rand fan. I think he's one of the guys who wants to like start a new nation on boats out in the middle of the ocean and have it be a true Randian libertarian society. Is that right?
Good, but deep.
His name is Peter what?
It's Thiel.
Is he the one who's recently been asking for suggestions or input on what to do with his money or something? I thought I heard that. Did you hear that?
I don't know.
That was Amazon guy.
Oh, that's Bezos, yeah.
Yeah, Bezos, right, sorry.
Mark Cuban, who loves to get his face in front of a camera, unsurprisingly is an Ayn Rand fan, also worth billions. Angelina Jolie is a fan of her books. I don't know how much of her philosophy. Anybody listen to the band Rush back in the day? Their drummer and their primary songwriter, Neil Peart, is a Ayn Rand fan. And if you pay attention to their lyrics, you can actually pick up some Randian type lyrics in their music. The little spaceship might be a giveaway there. It's the Starship Enterprise. That's Gene Roddenberry, who is also a Ayn Rand fan. Yeah, that usually gets a jaw or two to drop. People don't think, I thought he was a good guy.
It's too busy to think about it.
And again, I don't know to what extent he accepted or what exact views, but he did express admiration for her writing and her thinking. For a lot, Hugh Hefner is another one. Terry Goodkind, who's a novelist, quite popular nowadays, writes fantasy novels, orcs and elves and, some of this kind of Tolkien-esque sort of stuff. Has a lot of Rand-type themes in his work. This is just a tiny sample. If you look around on the web, you can find all kinds of people, other people in sports and business and politics, you name it. Yeah, I think in at least some of these cases, what people admired in her philosophy was this message of sort of self-improvement and productivity and achievement. Whether or not you agree with her politics, you can say, her emphasis on that is a laudable thing.
The consistency I see in there also with many of these is there no compromise. That idea that the middle is evil.
Yeah, it'd be difficult to be a big Ayn Rand fan and not have a strong streak of that running through you. If you really are sort of the accommodationist, looking for the middle ground sort of thinker, her work isn't going to resonate real strongly with you. So now we're going to get into a little bit more technical stuff, some of the scholarly intellectual philosophy she wanted to build in behind some of the other stuff, and then we'll get to some of the other stuff as we go on. So in sort of a traditional philosophical enterprise, if you were going to put a whole philosophy together, there's generally 4 parts you would have in your philosophy. The foundation of your philosophy would be your metaphysical views. So what do you think is real? What do you think is not real? Is the most fundamental question. So if you decide, like Rand, that God is not real, that's going to impact how you live and what you think at these higher levels. If you decide God is real and must be worshipped, again, you get a very different philosophy that will come from that foundation. So metaphysics is sort of the base for everything else. Epistemology then is your theory of knowledge. What do we know? How do we know it? How do we build up from the foundations of our knowledge? So if you take your theory of reality and your theory of knowledge, out of those 2 things are going to come your view of how people should live, based on what's real and how we know it. And based on how you think people should live, you can build some sort of a view of law and government and politics. And political philosophy comes from that. I think in Rand's case, it wasn't a matter of starting from metaphysics, adding epistemology, getting ethics, and then she started with political philosophy. She started with communism is evil, and I need to get out of Russia and go to the land of the free. And then the other stuff came later as ways to support the political philosophy. That was where her real and ultimate commitment was. So in her case, the foundation, even if it comes historically later than some of her other thinking, is what you would probably call naturalism. So there are no supernatural entities. There's only physical stuff. There's only natural facts. There is no human mind, there's a brain. There are no spirits, there are no souls, there are no divine beings, there's only natural, objective physical facts. That's her foundation. Her epistemology involved the senses. Obviously we see, touch, taste, smell, hear these physical things, but we can't rely on our senses to tell us what's actually there. We need our reason, our intelligence to sort through the physical data to tell us what is really there, because our senses can deceive us, often do. Did somebody see that? No. That blue spot on the road that keeps moving ahead of the car at 100 yards, it's just the sky reflecting, it's not water. All that kind of stuff, right? So, just physical stuff, absolute reason, and again, no middle ground, absolute reason, this sort of either-or mentality. Everything's either a contradiction or it's unreal. There's always only 2 sides. And one is right. So what do you get when you throw that together? Well, for her, for reasons I'll add in as we go, you get this theory of egoism or selfishness, the virtue of selfishness, she liked to call it. In philosophical lingo, that's usually described as rational egoism. So egoism would be the theory that the right thing to do is whatever benefits you, but there are different variations of that. There'd be sort of the naive egoist who would just seek immediate gratification. That's not Rand, right? It's not about immediate gratification. It's about rational, long-term self-interest. And from that basis of rational egoism, she builds this political, legal, governmental theory focused on individual liberty. One of her favorite quotes as minority issues became more important in this country was to say, you know, a single person is a minority. So the greatest evil is to violate the minority of one. It always, somehow, these violations involve people's property, almost always rich people's property. So a lot of people ask questions about what she meant by the selfishness and so on. So the Ayn Rand Institute, I took this right off their webpage. They describe what she meant by that as follow reason, not whims or faith, work hard to achieve a life of purpose and productiveness, earn genuine self-esteem, pursue your own happiness as your highest moral aim, prosper by treating others as individuals, trading value for value. Well, I mean, 4 of those 5 seem pretty innocuous, right? And 4 of those 5 seem like things most anybody would probably agree with, at least as general ideas. The one that seems to stand out as being more controversial is the pursue your own happiness as your highest moral aim. The others don't strike me, at least, as being especially controversial. So, quote from Rand, my philosophy in essence is the concept of man as a heroic being with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute. That's a bit more controversial when she puts it that way. Productive achievement as his noblest activity. Well, I mean, productive achievement meant to her economic productivity. Other sorts of productivity wouldn't count as being noble aims for Rand. You know, the stay-at-home parent whose productivity consists of raising children. Not exactly what she has in mind. Volunteer work, not the kind of productivity she really has in mind. Yeah?
What does that say then about these devotees of Rand? We see this loathsome focus on money and self and selfishness and then denigration of other human beings. And these people, and we now have some of them designing the health care bill, where other people are, you know, losers and worthless, and the highest good is money for the winners. Where are we headed?
Yeah, it's impossible to say. I mean, maybe this is a fad and will go away. It might be one of these political cycles that we have in our history where it swings kind of to the left for a while and then it swings back to the right. And I couldn't do a political prognostication. I mean, by all indications, if the Republicans don't keep some major aspects of Obamacare, they're going to face significant political repercussions down the road. So,
For the meantime, some people are going to...
absolutely. But, I mean, again, you have to keep in mind her view. Her view of reality, like Nietzsche, is life's a jungle. It's dog eat dog. Nobody is obligated to look out for you. Your parents are up to a certain age because they agreed to have you. So they made a contract with you, in a sense, to care for you up to a certain age. But after that, they owe you nothing. They may have their own love for you, help you, and do anything they want for you, but they owe you nothing. Same thing for any two adults. Nobody owes anybody anything, unless there's been a transaction that creates an obligation. So that's just their view of reality. I suspect you disagree with their view of reality.
No, what I'm saying is, what does that say about Paul Ryan, who required his workers who worked on his campaign, people who worked for him in office, required
Sure.
that they read Ayn Rand
Yeah.
and adhere to those philosophies. And that's,
Again, I don't know to what extent he would require them to agree with this or that, or, I mean, any politician is gonna hire people who support their particular agenda. So whether he made them read it or not, he was gonna make them buy into certain ideas, or they wouldn't be hired to work for him, right?
well, I just picked up a card that Ron in his office in DC, that Ron Johnson gives to his staff. And when it comes down to the loyalty, your first loyalty is to yourself. And then your next loyalty is to Ron Johnson. America is last on the list.
It sounds very Randian.
And
That sounds very
And it's
Randian.
very disturbing.
So what's the society's obligation to the guy who's got, comes down with Ebola?
Well, she would start by saying there's no such thing as society. Society is a fiction. There's only individual people.
Okay, so what's an
So-
individual's obligation to that person that has Ebola? I mean, the problem is,
Nothing other than your own self-interest. It's in your self-interest probably to control Ebola outbreaks. So probably you should do something about that, but not the government.
okay,
Because the government is evil, private organizations are good. So we would want to contribute to private health organizations to deal with outbreaks like that. Because in a case like that, you're not being forced. So again, it's back to the force or fraud. Individuals should not use force or fraud. Governments should not use force or fraud, except in these cases of police protection and military protection and things like that.
and developing, a vaccine, that is government, and that's what they do. And that's where this whole idea goes off the tracks.
But she would say private companies.
But you would say private companies can and should do that, and if you support their work, then you should support those companies.
Right.
The difference is whether we do this by force or whether we do it voluntarily. Do you think that we should force people to pay for opera? Should we force people? She would say no, but that's no different than forcing people to pay for health care they don't want or need.
We do.
Or forcing people to, yeah,
We do both.
yeah, but she would say they're both wrong.
Yeah, of course,
Yeah.
but they ain't so bad getting wrong.
I think this philosophy is behind the privatization of prisons.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Privatization of every government program they can, if possible, right? Yeah.
Did she have a view on things like social security?
Oh, for sure,
My
sure.
understanding is that Paul Ryan was raised on survivor benefits from social security. How would she read that?
Paul
I
Ryan.
want to hold off on answering that because that's my very kicker at the end.
Oh, okay. All right.
So sorry, but hold off for a little while on that one because there's an absolutely fantastic story about that we'll get to. So yeah, fill in the blank government program. If it's not about protecting people from rape or theft or murder, then it's a bad program.
So there are
from my
no
point of view.
public goods. There are no public goods. Is that?
She viewed public goods in the same way she viewed the term society. Society is just an aggregate of individual people. A public good is just an aggregate of individual goods. There's no such thing as a public good.
Profit-seeking individuals provide whatever goods there are in the world, in the country.
Yeah, so one of the things I'm not sure about, for example, is her view of public education, taxpayer-supported public schools. I mean, you can't help but think that she would have some problems with that, because you're forcing people to pay for something they may not agree to.
And highways, and telephones, and
Exactly.
electronics.
So where exactly she would draw the line, I don't know. I don't know that she ever addressed precise lines like that, but you can't have every road be a toll road. That's a non-functional system, right? You can't have every stop light be, you know. So again, I don't know what her answer would be in a lot of the very specific things. She would target the big government programs that are the most costly and the most obviously objectionable from a point of view like that.
Among Alan Greenspan's cohorts at the Chicago School, the philosophy about things like public school was Milton Friedman came out proposing charter schools and vouchers in 1953, and his idea was that it should all be a shopping center where you pay for your school with government money, but you choose it from a marketplace. So I think if you ever hear an interview with either of the Koch brothers at this point, they very much espouse the idea that government should be not regulating, should be not, interfering, that it's a very hands-off, let the market do its thing, whatever it's going to do.
So your EpiPen is.
It's, let the market worry about that, and let the, some people are expendable, really, in their philosophy. And hers too. Reading Atlas Shrugged, it's been 40 years since I read it, but I was shocked at these ideas, because I've been raised as a good Lutheran, and they were completely opposite of what I've been taught. I would really encourage you, if you haven't read her novels, if nothing else, to read them to see how I thought her ideas were inflammatory. I was just shocked.
What were you going to say?
Oh, I was, this is such a complete difference from the program I was listening to WPR about Dorothy Day.
You were listening to her?
Dorothy Day.
Oh,
My Catholic workers. Did she ever say anything about altruism, whether or not that philosophy, she obviously disagreed that it exists, that did use any such thing?
Altruism is evil.
Okay.
Yeah.
And has she written about that?
Oh, yes. A lot of her writings are about that. The readings in my ethics class deal primarily with that. So again, part of it is you can get kind of tricky with how you define altruism and egoism. So, like at the one quote, she says, if somebody demands you help them, don't. If you choose to help them, that's fine.
And if
Well,
that makes you happy.
if that makes you happy.
And that is part of your value system.
Yes.
Then altruism would.
But is that altruism or isn't it? She would say that's,
You
she would say that's not altruism. She would define as something where you don't get what you want and it makes you miserable. And you're doing it because if you have to. Well, in that sense, so how you define altruism can make a difference. So in my classes, when we talk about this, a lot of my students say, they sort of get hung up on this because they want to say we've got some kind of obligation to help people even if we may not want to, at least in certain circumstances. But they all also say that it's important that it make you happy when you do that. So they want the best of both worlds.
So where does the concept of self-determination fit into her thinking?
We can't hear you.
Where does the concept of self-determination fit into her thinking?
I don't know that she uses those exact kind of terms, but that would be very important. The idea of the autonomous person, the self-choosing, self-determined person is her ideal. That's the way we all need to be. We shouldn't allow others to, manipulate us into believing this or doing that. We have to stand up using our absolute reason and decipher truth and falsehood and never take the middle ground.
Like we're in a vacuum. Not.
Yeah. I sometimes think of her view as being like Tinker Toys. It's like the little round part here is me, and this is you, and you, and you, and you, and you. And we can put a little spoke to connect us by a mutual agreement. And if we don't, by mutual agreement, put a spoke between us, then there's no connection between us. That's sort of her, we're all these separate, autonomous selves. And we have no responsibility or relationship to each other unless by mutual agreement we decide that that's in our interest to do so.
That's why there's no society in her mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then what happens when there's a conflict or a war? That's
Society.
bad part of government?
No. So police protection, military protection is acceptable from her point of view to protect basic rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and property, right? So we want government to do that. She was, as I recall, for the most part, opposed war except in self-defense or retaliation. Right? So she had some comment about in the neocon era of taking the war against the terrorists overseas, she was not a fan of that. So unless they attack us first, you leave them be.
Did she ever talk about prisons, do you know? Prisons and how she...
Not that I know of, but again, I'm sure her view would be private prisons rather than state-run prisons. Yeah, we're going to talk about unions in a little bit too, because she has, I think, a little bit of a paradox in her system when you think about certain things like labor unions. So this rational egoism is the key part that underlies all this political stuff. So just a little bit about the rational egoism part. This is one of her famous quotes. Now I see the face of God, and I raise this God over the earth, this God whom men have sought since men came into being, this God who will grant them joy and peace and pride, this God, this one word, I. So she also has a famous quote about, in order to say I love you, there first has to be I. So everything starts with the self.
Doesn't that also take the notion of personal responsibility?
It does, but again, her view would be your responsibilities can't be foisted onto you by others. Your responsibilities are what you agree to or commit to as part of your plan of life and your own values. And if other people demand that you owe them something and you don't, then you refuse. So we talk a lot about
drowning and demands help, help. And you say, I don't owe you anything.
Okay, so now we've got another little technical part of her philosophy. So in one of her writings, she talks about the ethics of emergencies. So she did think in emergency situations, you had an obligation to help. But in non-emergency situations, you did. So if you're on a boat that's sinking, you ought to try to help somebody else get off. If somebody's drowning and you're capable of saving them, you should try to help. So, but she didn't have a technical definition of emergency situations. So what would count as one and what wouldn't could be debatable. But she did think in emergency situations, you had obligations in virtue of the value of human life. Normal day-to-day stuff wouldn't count as an emergency situations. Healthcare for her, from her point of view, would not count as an emergency situation.
Given her early experience of government as communism, I mean, when she moved to the U.S., did she comment on a democracy that is functioning, at least, has many people's opinion? I mean, does she see democracy as different than being forced to take vaccines or whatever? Or
She was not a fan of democracy.
she wasn't?
So she
She-
benefited from it.
Her view was that most people are idiots and don't have a plan for life and aren't selfish and don't know how to get what they want. So they vote for silly things that they shouldn't be voting for. So she came in the 20s in an era where we were still sort of laissez-faire capitalists, just prior to the New Deal and the big expansion of government. So those were her early years here, and a lot of her novels are really based on this, her seeing the New Deal and how that developed and opposing it, right? So, she is, I think, a prime example of a philosopher whose philosophy comes so much from the events of their life rather than their own intellectual creativity or thinking. Every philosopher's views are impacted by things going on in their life, but hers far more so than many others.
Do we know what the household was like that she grew up in? Father was educated, wealthy, the mother didn't want children. Did they have some of this opinion? Or might this be a reaction to her home, what she grew up with?
Oh, undoubtedly, some of it is. There have been several books written on Rand's early life. I haven't read them, and there are a number of controversies about all of this, or how we should interpret certain events that occurred, that we know occurred. So I can't jump into that other than to say, just as our childhood impacts all of us, undoubtedly her childhood impacted her. And like I said at the start, she did not have a normal childhood by any stretch of the imagination. And she was not a normal child by any stretch of the imagination. She was that strong-willed kid who's not accommodating mom or dad or brother or sister or teacher.
So did she have siblings? Did she have any brothers or sisters?
You know, off the top of my head, I can't recall. I think she did. I think she did. I know she had at least a sister. But again, mom was kind of like not present. So maybe there's a connection there. She was raised in a home where her parents didn't extend any particular love or sympathy or help to her. That was just normal for her. So it would seem odd to her, I suppose, to be in a family where people did do that.
Probably left Russia without looking back on what of my family.
Well, she did keep corresponding with her family after she left, so that it wasn't like sayonara, I hate you all, or something like that. But again, it just would have been normal for her to grow up in that environment.
You know, I read the books when I was in high school, and from that, younger time, I just thought, well, I think I could understand her philosophy coming from living and growing up in communism. That, it's such a group focus that, there was no value of the individual, and people wore the same colored clothes at that time, I thought that was the case when I grew up anyway, that people wore the same sort of all drab-looking clothes. You see these pictures, and so I felt like I could understand her reaction to that, and that's where my understanding of her came. But the not embracing what she was able to go to in the U.S. and seeing the value of it, that was always disappointing as I got older. That philosophy seemed, well, maybe it was just a response to what she had come from, is how I've accepted it.
That certainly is huge. The other thing I was going to add, though, was, no, I think it might have slipped away. Sorry. So in sort of philosophical lingo, you would state her ethical view, something like this: an act as right means equals of the alternative actions that you could perform. The right one is the one that would probably produce the greatest happiness for you. And again, not just any happiness, but rational happiness. She always had this emphasis on it being reason. So let me give you an example. So you would think an egoist would say, if you could tell a lie and benefit by it, that there'd be no problem. That would be the right thing to do. And certainly if no one else was harmed, there would be nothing wrong with it. Rand, however, thought, but again, because of this metaphysical foundation, a lie is sort of intrinsically wrong because the lie is inconsistent with reality. So any lie, big lies, little lies, in-between lies, white lies, they're all wrong because they all, instead of actually giving you advantage over someone else, actually put you at a disadvantage to others because you've stated something unreal that they could then use against you. Right? So she had a wonderful way of sort of turning things around in ways you maybe didn't expect. The best example of saving to last.
The most powerful visualization I have of hers is in the Fountainhead, where the architect blows up his building because they changed it. That's haunted me most of my life. Because I've never been able to kind of wrap my brain around that. But that seemed to epitomize her philosophy.
Yeah.
And I just can't get it. That he would blow this building up before he would accept the reality that someone had changed to
It's my way or the highway, Lee.
I know.
That's Rand, right?
I know, there are people who behave this way, but that doesn't mean I'm able to accommodate them.
Again, it's the no compromise.
Yeah.
One's right, one's wrong, that's it. And of course, who's right is always me. Right?
Works at my house.
But I think it's part of the anti-regulation thing. I mean, what did they do to the building? Do you remember? What was the change they made?
I don't remember.
Because I always would wonder, what about it needed to be a change because of some traffic pattern or, something that was needed for the public good that it was obvious to us, why it would need to be done, but then it would somehow alter the building that would make it unacceptable to her.
I don't think it made any difference what the change was.
Or for the purpose of the change.
Yeah, it was that there was a change. And it could have been for safety, it could have been for anything, but I didn't think that made any difference.
So at the same time, I read Le Petit Prince, and the picture on the front of one edition is the planet, with nothing on it except this one little figure. And that's where you could have that building, the way she wanted it. That's the only where is if you could maybe isolate it, buy an island and put it on the island. You own the island, but that's the only place this kind of philosophy exists that I could understand.
Well, her philosophy would make more sense if, in fact, everybody was a rational, autonomous adult.
Like Trump.
In fact, we're very far from being rational, autonomous adults. So, I mean, her view when she talks about people being greedy, well, I mean, if you're going to be greedy, but you're being rational about it, you would minimize harms you do to other people. Because if you harm other people, that means they're going to try to get back at you in some way. For example, by voting in politicians who take away your rights or something, or enforce building restrictions or whatnot. So, I mean, if people really were rational, long-term, autonomous thinkers, we would greatly minimize these sorts of things. But people aren't. People are greedy and they want short-term and immediate gratification. And so people do lots of things they shouldn't do and don't make sense. But that's not her view. The do whatever makes me a quick buck philosophy, that's not Rand. That's how some people interpret Rand, or just choose to live, but that's not her.
Would she have any gratification in life if she didn't have an audience?
I'll go out on a limb and say that. No, I mean, that's why she went to Hollywood, right? I mean, she came to the United States and she went to Hollywood. She wanted an audience. She was very ambitious. She had big plans. She was going to do what it took to make it. You know, one of those kind of people. So, I mean, there's lots of other ways you could think about what's right and wrong, right? So you could contrast her view with, for example, any religious ethical view, which would say right and wrong has to do with whether you're obeying or acting in love of God or the other divine being of your religious ethical system. And of course, all that's out for her because there's no divine beings and supernatural anything. There's a lot of philosophers who don't have religious-based ethical views. Immanuel Kant's one of them, who thinks about right and wrong in terms of demonstrating or having a good will or good intentions in your action. You can't control the consequences, so if your will is good in performing the action, your intention is good, then you did the right thing, even if things somehow went wrong in the end. And of course, she's opposed to that too, because what he thinks about how he would define goodwill is defined in a way that has very altruistic implications and not self-interested ones at all. So he's got to go. Utilitarianism is extremely popular philosophical ethical view for the last 200 years or more. The right thing is whatever maximizes human happiness, the greatest good for the greatest number, sometimes it's described as. And of course, for her, again, that's irrelevant. It doesn't matter if it makes other people happy. I mean, that might be a bonus for you, because if you do things that make them happy, they might then do things for you and increase your long-term happiness. But what makes it right is not that they benefit. It's that you, either now or later, benefit. Or Nietzsche, as I've mentioned, who defines right and wrong in terms of the will to power. So, the one philosopher that sort of makes sense with her view, and whom she made some attempt to connect her philosophy to, is Aristotle. So Aristotle is a classic Greek philosopher who thought all existing things have an essence, and that essence is defined by their purpose. So an oak tree has an essence, and its essence is defined by its purpose. A horse, a human being, everything that exists operates in that sort of a way. So for her, reason is the human essence. It's our perfection. It's what makes us different from everything else that exists. So to be fully human is to perfect reason. Then if you think of reason the way she does, in this kind of either or, no compromise, everything's a logical contradiction kind of perspective, then all these other alternatives have to be eliminated, because in the end, all you have is you. In the end, that's all your reality is you and your values. So reason dictates that individual, personal happiness, selfishness, if you want to call it that, which she liked to, is what ultimately has value, and it's the only thing that has value. Because if we introduce anything else into our system, what does that mean? It means those two things will then come into conflict. And if those two things come into conflict, one has to win and one has to lose. And what wins? So the other one doesn't really have value. It's really just this.
How many relationships was she in? How many times did she get married? I mean,
Well, she was only married once to Frank Connor, and they were married for, I mean, from the 30s until she died in 82, right? I can't speak to how happy their marriage was. I mean, she did have a long-term affair with Nathaniel Braden, which he knew about and accepted, at least to some extent. Which raises again the question of the nature of human agreement. How many agreements do you make are fully autonomous and self-determined? And how many agreements do you make are something less than that? we make a lot of agreements that are probably something less than fully autonomous and self-determined.
So it's about competitiveness. When you said that if you bring something into this, then you're going to have two things, and one is going to win and one is going to lose. So everything is always competitive,
Absolutely.
not coexisting,
Absolutely.
collaborating.
And, I mean, she is right in the sense that if you have two values, there will be cases where you can't fulfill both values. It doesn't matter what two values you pick. There will be cases, maybe unusual ones, but there will be cases where those two things conflict and one has to win and one has to lose. Now, most of us would have the view that, well, there might be reasons why in this situation this one wins, and there might be reasons why in this other situation the other one wins. But if you think like Rand, that would be a contradiction, an inconsistency. If this one wins in this case, then that one has to win in every case. Okay? So why does self-interest has to come first? Because if you really lived altruistically, you would have to give away everything you own. You wouldn't be able to eat, you wouldn't be able to drink, you wouldn't be able to have clothing, you wouldn't be able to have a home. You have to give it away to somebody else. Of course, that's a recipe for death. So the only way to survive is to put yourself at the start. And you can add on to the self voluntarily and willingly when it's in your interest to do so, but not by force or fraud of someone else.
It's very absolute.
Very absolute. Well, again, I mean, the only way to get around it really is to be able to show that this either-or mentality fails. That things are not absolute and that these things are not really contradictions and that there are logical and good reasons why this value should win here but not there. So again, this gets rid of religious ethics, this throws out the goodwill, this throws out the utilitarians, this throws out the Nietzschean types. So that's what you get. If you start with that starting point and you think of reason in that sort of a way, then you get what Rand got. So a very common objection people have to this is, well, if happiness is what has value, and seems to be your view, then why wouldn't happiness itself have value? Why would it just be my happiness? Why wouldn't your happiness have value too? So I might have to try to maximize both of our happiness rather than just mine. Or in some cases, maybe I would have to rate your happiness above my happiness if it's really happiness that has value. No middle ground. Rule number one, no middle ground. You have to pick one or the other, and you have to pick the self or you die, period. Investment courses at UCLA. So, rational egoism. Was it in Michael Milken's rational interest to do what he did? No, I mean, you might say, Rand would say, no, because it involved fraud, right? But, wait a second. He paid a little cost for what he did, but did he come out ahead in the long run? You know what he did after that? He developed cancer, so he started a cancer foundation, and then he went around the country and got people to contribute to his cancer foundation. This is a slick operator, right? So one of the questions I have about Rand is how you can say you're for rational egoism, but yet say something like that isn't really what a rational egoist would do. If you know you come out ahead in the deal, even though there will be some penalty you will have to pay, why wouldn't it be in my interest to do it? Or here's another one. So, I'm a McDonald's worker in Seattle, and they want to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. So I vote for people to go into the city council who will do that, because then I'll get a raise. Well, now that would seem like that would make sense from a rational egoist point of view. I benefit by doing that. Rand, however, would say that that is not what a rational egoist should do. Because, anybody know why? It's the reliance on government, and it's forcing other people to fulfill governmental dictates. And once you accept that principle, that means that you have to accept whatever governmental dictates get imposed upon you. Well, wait a second. I'm a rational egoist. How about I support people who do what I want, and I oppose people who don't do what I want? Isn't that rational? I mean, that's sort of the democratic system that we exist in. Sometimes I win, sometimes I lose. But no, again, in Rand's view, a labor union, she had to agree, was in the interest of the individual union member. But she strongly opposed labor unions because they involved collective action, collective bargaining. So again, it seems like a paradox in her view, how something could be in my interest, but not be a rationally egoistic choice to make. So onto her politics. So as political philosophers often do, they sort of divide things up, excluding foreign policy or things along those lines. They divide the political world into economic issues and civil issues. So for her, again, the economic liberty is primary because on her view, civil liberties can't be acted on without an economic foundation. I don't really have free speech unless I have the ability to speak through a newspaper or through something else, which requires money. So she opposed Sunday laws. So there aren't very many of these left anymore, but I can remember growing up, you know, all the businesses in town were closed on Sunday, right? Why? A religious holiday. Well, religion. That's got to go. So all the so-called Sunday laws are things that she opposed. Yes to all the laws protecting people from unjustified aggression. So then the question you have to ask, you had already asked in a way earlier about the public roads and schools, is, well, okay, does that mean government can protect consumers from evil companies with defective or dangerous products or fraudulent products? Does that mean the government can protect workers from companies that don't respect safe workplaces and et cetera? And I mean, you all know her answer, I assume. Her answer is no. Right? If you work for such a company, you should leave and work for somebody else. Right? Don't buy the products of companies that sell fraudulent or defective products. Just be an informed consumer. And I mean, in theory, that you can see how that makes sense, right? The trouble is, in practice, you don't usually know your product is defective until it's too late. You can't inspect your products beforehand, as you maybe could in 1820, and determine whether it's defective or not. I have no idea how my microwave runs, and I had no idea whether it would be defective or not when I purchased it. I only can discover that later. And theory and practice difficulties are always a bugaboo. So any law redistributing wealth is basically a no-no, especially social and corporate welfare. So she opposed all government handouts or favors or tax breaks to companies, just as she would for individual people. So then you get to these questions of, well, okay, where do you draw the line? Do you consider publicly funded schools one of these things? Fire departments, should we privately contract for fire protection? Should we privately contract for, libraries? Or a lot of this she didn't address. So again, the theoretical answer is always no, because nobody's life or liberty is at stake in these cases. But again, what's the reality of the practice of this?
There was a fellow, I think in Oregon, who he was CEO of his own business, and he raised everybody's rate of pay to $70,000 or something.
Yeah.
And so he was redistributing his wealth. And so what would she say about that? Because
That's fine.
he
If
wanted to do it.
you voluntarily want to do that as a business owner, that's perfectly acceptable. She'd say he's an idiot, but
Oh.
I mean, ethically, there's no problem with that. I mean, it would only make sense if you needed to do that, given the supply of people performing those jobs. So if I can only hire competent people by paying them that salary, then of course it makes perfectly good sense for me as a business owner to pay people that much. But if I can get those same people, same quality, to do the same job for half the money, I'd be an idiot to pay them twice what I have to. From her point of view.
Did she drive on private roads to get to work? Did she cross private bridges?
We'll hang on to that. That's coming up. That's coming up. Again, she had to live in the society in which she lived. Vastly preferable in her point of view to other alternatives, but in need of improvements. So, I mean, you don't get to choose whether to drive on a public road or not. If you want to get from point A to point B and it's a public road, you have to take a public road. So, would she prefer that it be a toll road? Well, so the other thing, which would be very controversial, this goes back to good old Barry Goldwater, right? Barry Goldwater, 1964 Civil Rights Act, that issue was crucial to that election, right? So Goldwater's position was racism and all this stuff is horribly evil, but we shouldn't force businesses to operate in ways they don't want to operate, right? That's Rand's view too. Racism is evil, all these isms are evil, sexism is evil, but the government shouldn't tell a business owner how to run their business unless somebody's life or property is at stake. So on the civil liberty side, which honestly she did not give that much attention to. It's the economic liberty that was the big priority, and she devotes most of her energies to discussing. But free speech, she's been an advocate of free speech. Separation of church and state, obviously, she would be a big supporter of. She opposed the laws that create so-called victimless crimes, so prostitution, for example, or dry counties. Kansas still has dry counties, things like this. Gambling restrictions, restrictions on sexual behavior, recreational drugs. She was all for legalizing these things. Again, the government has no business telling you what's good or bad for you. It's your choice as a rational, autonomous adult to make choices about these things. She supported women's right to abortion. Another reason she was at odds with religious right. And she's a strong opponent of affirmative action because, again, that sort of creates a group right rather than an individual right, and she did not recognize or acknowledge any group rights. So Rand obviously has a lot of critics, along with a lot of supporters. I'll just mention a couple here. One of the common criticisms to her ethical foundation, the selfishness, rational egoism, is to argue that self-interest has rational limits. There are good reasons to limit your own self-interest. And in other words, people will say something other than personal happiness has value. A religious person might say love and obedience to God's commands also has value, and personal happiness sometimes loses to that. The utilitarian would say the happiness of other people has the same value as your happiness, and sometimes your happiness loses to the happiness of others. So that's the most common argument against her ethics, is to argue there are some other values that she is not recognizing and make her ethical system defective. On the political side, obviously almost all the attention goes to the economic issues, the laissez-faire capitalism sort of a deal. One of the most common objections to that is some version of government regulation and redistribution is necessary to protect the life, liberty, property, and to provide for equal opportunity. So, I'm born sick. My family doesn't have the resources to pay for the health care necessary for me to live. Rand would say, too bad, so sad, unless private charity can help you out, or family, or something like that. A lot of other people would say, well, that child has a right to life just like any other child, and their economic conditions shouldn't deny them an opportunity. Another one of the objections, although this gets a little bit more philosophical, is the argument that nobody earns their wealth in a totally autonomous way. You didn't teach yourself everything, you didn't create all the products you use, et cetera, et cetera. There's a million ways in which the wealth you acquire was acquired through the assistance or cooperation of other people and through the laws that exist in that society. The laws are what enabled you to do this, and the laws don't have to be that way. They could be different. So your property is not 100% yours to use as you choose. It wasn't 100% yours in its creation. It's not 100% yours. Other people have a stake. It's a simpler way of putting it. Okay, so here's the big one. So imagine you are Ayn Rand. After a lifetime of heavy smoking, you have lung surgery in 1974. You will have very significant medical and personal health care bills for the rest of your life, however long that happens to be. Well, it turns out she continued to live for a number of years. Her wealth was dissipating. She has, through her whole life, attacked Social Security and Medicaid programs. Her personal care nurse argued with her that you need to start accepting Social Security and Medicaid benefits or you're going to go broke. What do you think Rand should do?
She took it.
Certainly not accept it, that's against her principles.
She took it.
Took it. Their best interest.
We have somebody in town that consistently wrote against Social Security and disability until he became 100% disabled.
Wow. You know that right here.
Yeah.
So the Ayn Rand Institute says this. Does she, should she? Yes. Now, that might seem hypocritical. They argue it is not. It is not hypocritical. In fact, they would say her situation is the one and only situation where it is ethical to accept the benefits. Why is it ethical in her case and not others? Well, because she opposes it, as you rightly should oppose it, and you're only accepting it because the government owes you it for the harm they've done you and others for all these years.
I've got it memorized.
The government was supposed to control our smoking and she didn't have that.
And then maybe we should go with that, and then all the chemicals would get cleaned up.
So on their view, the harm that's been done to her her whole life is only compounded if she doesn't take the benefits.
I don't get what harm has been done to her.
Well, she had to pay into the system. They took her money all those years, right? So she has been harmed by this forced
The cigarette
system.
companies or the Social Security?
Probably the Social Security, the government are taking her money.
It would be interesting to know what she would say about all the government lawsuits to make the companies pay for healthcare costs states had to pay for all those years. But obviously, Rand critics take a different view of all of this. They will say that it was hypocritical for her. Isabel Patterson, who I mentioned earlier, another early libertarian. Actually, there are three women who basically founded the modern libertarian movement. Patterson, who was sort of Rand's mentor, and Rose Wilder Lane. Does anybody ring a bell? Wilder?
Yes. Laura Ingalls?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. One of the three women who basically...
Laura Ingalls' daughter.
Yes, that's right.
But Laura Ingalls, Ingalls was the family. Okay, got it.
Yeah. So,
I'm gonna have to burn those books now.
so one of the things that's interesting about her accepting it was She kept it, another one of her secrets. She had a number of secrets. This was another one. She didn't let her followers know she was accepting this, which makes it look a little bit suspicious and hypocritical, isn't it? She didn't take it under her name. She took it under the name Anne O'Connor, a name she didn't use otherwise. And she didn't end up broke at all. She ended up with an estate worth about $500,000, which in today's dollars would be about $1.3 million. So, but then, you know, again, it's one of these situations of there's rational egoism, the theory, and then there's rational egoism as it seems like it makes sense to practice it in the real world. And there seems to be a pretty big divergence. And it seems like it's perfectly well in her rational self-interest to take these benefits. But according to her theory, no. So that's all I have. But you know, whatever questions people have or further conversations people want to have, let's go for it.
Comment on Paul Ryan, I thought.
Paul Ryan. What do people want to talk about with Paul Ryan?
Growing up on Social Security.
Did he get Social Security benefits because his father died?
That was what was growing up.
I don't know. You know, I would compare some of these to, well, okay, let's talk about the Koch brothers. So the Koch brothers, for example, are big critics of corporate welfare. They would like to see all these things gone. However, until they're gone, they will continue to accept them. Why? Because they need to stay on top of the competition. If they don't accept it, they're at a disadvantage in relationship to the competition. And they're under no obligation to accept a disadvantage against the competition. So I would say that same kind of thinking might be what's going on there. I might oppose this program and like to see it gone. And if it didn't exist, I wouldn't get that benefit. But so long as it does exist, I'm entitled to take the benefits just like anybody else is. And in fact, I'll get a disadvantage in a relationship to other people in this dog-eat-dog world. If I don't accept benefits, they will accept.
And yet the politicians bringing forward these ideas now, and their supporters, like the Koch brothers, are actively working to create these benefits for the corporations, as opposed to simply passively taking them. They are actively lobbying for them.
The divergence between theory and practice, and again, the divergence between rationalism as it seems like it makes sense in the real world, and rational egoism as she formulated it in her writings.
I'd like to know how her thought came to seduce so many people in power. There are other thinkers, other economic philosophers who did not tread this path. But what magic did she have that seduced them?
Milton Friedman, the Koch brothers, and their father.
Part of it is just the cult of personality bit. She was very influential, well-spoken, could argue the socks off of anybody that she ran into. And so I think if you're a young, and a lot of her followers were people who were attracted to her as they're 18, 17, 16, maybe 19 years old. They see somebody phenomenally successful. They see somebody whose message they're sympathetic with to begin with. They want to get ahead in life. They want to get to the top. They see how life is a competition and a struggle, and they want to make sure they get to the top. I can see this easily getting somebody with that mindset.
She wasn't the only one saying that, was she?
Well, you know, again, amongst philosophers, there's nothing new in it. If you took a philosophy class, you'd run into any number of philosophers who make arguments along the lines that she does. I mean, in popular culture, not many people were saying that, which is why the heavily Christian Republican Party's initial response to her was, she's all wrong and she's evil and we need to ignore her. Yeah?
I heard her speak in Chicago. I had a younger brother who was kind of an amateur fan of hers. And so he asked me if I would go along with him and went down to McCormick Place and heard her talk. What she does is she weaves a very tight little world here. And anything that's within it is consistent, it's logical, it's reasonable, it's good. This is, and anything outside that anyone brings in, oh, that's evil. That's not recognized, so forth. And so you end up at the end of her speech thinking, well, if this tight little world that she describes, not that she lives in, but that she describes, if that's reality, then by God, she's right.
Mhm.
Yeah. But once you get outside that, now you begin to wobble a little bit,
Right. But I mean, to me, a lot of this is epitomized by the split between her followers after her death. So you have the true believers who aren't going to go beyond anything she said and are going to defend everything she said and nothing else. The tight little circle, nothing gets outside this because inside that little circle, we always win. And then you have the other people who are like, well, I mean, the world's bigger than just that tight little circle, and we need to address that too. Well, but that makes you a heretic and you're cast away. Right?
I was going to ask how she did respond to critics. Did she enjoy a debate, a robust conversation to defend her position, or did she just like to just shut it down and say, I'm right, you're wrong?
She preferred to proselytize young minds, as far as I can
She
tell.
wasn't open.
She liked an audience predisposed to her message. So, I mean, she did engage in some of those sorts of things. And so, again, if you can go to YouTube and watch some YouTube videos of her in action. And the Phil Donahue show one is kind of interesting to see because it's people who are not very sympathetic to her based on the questions they're asking. So they're asking her some pretty hard questions, and she seems kind of uncomfortable trying to answer those questions because they're not being asked on her terms. They're coming from outside her tight little circle, and then it makes it hard for her to answer because they're not in that well-trod ground that she can run circles around everybody in. So she makes this comment about the president that nobody understands. It's not in the tight little circle.
So all the people that you show pictures of, the Ayn Rand supporters, they can't think for themselves. They just grab onto her philosophy, they have no thought, they have no rational...
Oh, I wouldn't say that. I'd say a lot of those people are actually very intelligent people. They just happen to agree with more or less. Again, I couldn't say specifically what parts they agree or disagree with. It wouldn't be any different than other people who admire, so I'm an admirer of John Stuart Mill. I think John Stuart Mill is right about a lot of things. But I don't think that makes me a sycophant or something like that. I think I can still judge his philosophy based on my own experience and rational abilities. So are some of them sycophants? Yeah, probably. A lot of people think Alan Greenspan was. So, I don't know if he was or not, but I've heard or read as much. Nathaniel Branden, I don't think he was. I think maybe initially. And it wouldn't be consistent with her philosophy to be that way.
I don't know if you can object to this, but her husband, to whom she remained married, met him in Hollywood where she wanted to become part of the literary action.
Mm-hmm.
Did he agree with her and that's one of the attractions? Or did this philosophy develop over the course of their relationship?
Well, the details developed over the course of the relationship. I think the basic foundation was there when she came here, probably. You know, the anti-collective, anti-communist, pro-laissez-faire, that was there from the get-go.
So he probably had some of the same feelings then.
I suspect so. I think he was an ambitious actor, it just didn't work out. For whatever reason, he didn't have the connections or the talent or something, but he did not ever really make it.
He wasn't a writer? Or
He's an artist of some type.
Yeah, I'm not sure what all he did. He's certainly second fiddle to her.
It's kind of interesting to consider what attracts people. Did he support her in her beliefs, or did she support, just agree to live with it? Just curious.
I don't know the answer to that. I think he had to have had a pretty good idea what he was getting into.
And he had to agree in some way to
And,
remain married for so long.
Maybe it was just the best option. He acted in his own rational self-interest.
After all, she did have $1.8 million when she died.
She did all right. Yeah?
You had mentioned the Koch brothers, and we're talking about how closely they follow her. Just an interesting point, they do have an oil refinery south of the cities. Used to be called Koch Oil Refinery, now it's called Pine Bend Resources, Flint Hills, and they almost exclusively hire union people to maintain and repair that facilities. Interesting that they're against unions, but they do hire them, and they do the work.
Because,
Yeah, they're
when
in
you
best
people are
interest.
trained.
Work better.
It makes, to me, her system makes a whole lot more sense if you forget her theory part and just take the rational egoism part, the way we ordinarily think about rational and ego. It wouldn't make me agree with it, it just means I really understand that.
The little quote you have up there is, I think she's dead on. You can ignore reality, but you can't ignore the consequences of ignoring reality.
Yeah, well, I would say Rand said some true things. And, I think I mentioned this earlier, her emphasis on, people having goals in life and having values in life and knowing what those are and trying to achieve them and being a productive person in whatever sense you can be productive. I mean, these are all things I would support. I wouldn't take it all in the directions that she does, but there is a core of her philosophy that I think rings true for most people.
I got involved with the Conservative Party in the late 60s and early 70s, and I watched the transformation to where the religious right came in. That's when I got out. But it seemed to me that Anne was an enigma. Not everybody really understood her in depth, but she was used to justify greed. And if you look at what's happened in our thinking in economics, greed has really, really taken over. And I think she's used the self and as a kind of an unknown, but an idol, and I think it's time we all rethink it. And look, in the days of the 60s, you were first fighting communism, secondly, it was a Judeo-Christian world, and all your views you were supposed to share and what have you. So this was a great way to say, oh, hell no, it's mine, step back, this is mine. And it worked. It worked very well. Not always to our benefit.
Yeah, I mean, you can think of different personality types too. So probably all of you know somebody who has sort of the giver personality. They're always giving to others, always giving to others. And when you look at whether they seem very happy or not, sometimes it seems they're really not very happy at all. They've just been trained or brought up in such a way that they have to act that way. So I think to a person like that, Rand's message might get them to a middle ground, you know, where maybe they can continue to help others, but also start to do more self-help and self-care and that kind of thing, and be happier as a result. My daughter is a therapist and has all kinds of friends and coworkers who are therapists, and these are people who kind of need to be reminded once in a while of take care of yourself, because they get so wrapped up in caring for people who have, so she deals only with trauma patients. So people really have, she reminds me all the time when I complain about my complaints being first world complaints. I try not to complain around because she's right. So, you know, again, all things in moderation. So it was sort of my message, very anti-Rand. Rand in moderation is probably not a bad thing. Rand taken too seriously, you know, yikes.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've enjoyed this tremendously. Have a great day.